Lizzie Borden, bottom of page 201. Day 10, Thursday, June 15th, 1893. With that, the prosecution rested. Eli Bent's testimony was supposed to be Knowlton's climax. Without it, he had nothing left, and his case closed with a dull thud instead of a bang. The time had come for Lizzie Borden's lawyers, the best legal team money could buy, to have their say. Already their actions had said plenty. The defense, the New York Tribune noted, appeared to have deliberately allowed the prosecution considerable leeway. Robinson, Jennings, and Adams rarely raised objections, resisted interrupting or trying to confuse the government's witness, and for the most part sat passively by while Moody and Knowlton coached their witness with leading questions. Although the defense's tactics were considered old-fashioned even then, it nevertheless conveyed an air of confidence, silently suggesting that Lizzie Borden had nothing to hide, nothing to fear from the prosecution's evidence. It worked so well that a rumor was circulating that the defense would turn the case over to the jury without another word. Robinson, Jennings, and Adams were not quite that bold, but they were brief. The defense would take only 2 days to present Lizzie's case. As he had done at the preliminary hearing, lawyer Jennings opened by appealing first to emotion rather than reason, explaining to the jury his lifelong personal connection with the Borden family. I want to say right here now, if I manifest more feeling than perhaps you think necessary in making an opening statement for the defense in this case, you will ascribe it to that cause. The counsel, Mr. Foreman, a gentleman, does not cease to be a man when he becomes a lawyer. Jennings focused on the contrast between the brutality of the murder and Lizzie Borden herself. We shall show you that this young woman, as I have said, had apparently led an honorable, spotless life. She was a member of the church. She was interested in church matters. She was connected with various organizations for charitable work. She was ever ready to help in any good thing and any good deed, and yet for some reason or other, the government, in its investigation, seemed to fasten the crime upon her. The only thing more shocking than the crime itself, he asserted, was the fact that such a woman stood accused of it. I say this is a mysterious case, Jennings acknowledged. Every thinking man must say the same. But, he reminded them, their task was not to solve the mystery. The issue is a simple and direct one. The Commonwealth here has charged that Lizzie Andrew Borden, in a certain way, at a certain time, killed Andrew Jackson Borden and Abby DeFree Borden with malice aforethought. And that alone, is the question that you are to answer. Did she, and on the day, commit that deed? Did she commit it in the way alleged? The evidence the prosecution had presented, he stressed, was purely circumstantial. There is not a spot of blood, there is not a weapon that they have connected with her in any way, shape, or fashion. They have not had her hand touch it, or her eye see it, or her ear hear of it. At best, there was only half a motive. All along, the government's case had pointed to a single murderer, yet, regardless of how Lizzie felt about her stepmother, they had not attempted to show a reason for her to murder her father. Nor had Knowlton produced the murder weapon. Once Professor Wood's preliminary hearing testimony ruled out the claw-headed hatchet, Jennings noted with perceptible sarcasm they had quietly substituted the hoodoo hatchet in its place, but they had not connected any of them to Lizzie Borden. Then came the question of exclusive opportunity. Jennings reminded the jury that the prosecution had failed to rule out the possibility of a murderer escaping from the house. In addition, Jennings said, there has not been a living soul put on the stand here to testify that they saw Andrew J. Borden come down the street from his house. From his house to the Union Savings Bank, he has been absolutely invisible. Was it any easier for him to be unseen than it would be for somebody escaping from the house if they walked quietly away? Not only that, but other strange people had been seen in the vicinity, people who had been located or identified. Everything else Jennings promised Miss Lizzie visits to the barn. Officer Medley's failure to find her footprints in the Bedford could and would be explained. In view of that, and all of that had come before Jennings concluded, we shall ask you to say, Mr. Foreman and gentlemen, whether the government has satisfied you beyond a reasonable doubt that she did kill not only her stepmother, Abby DeFree Borden, and her loved and loving father, Andrew Jackson Borden, on the 4th day of August last. Lizzie Borden was in tears. After 9 days of suspicion and scrutiny, Lawyer Jennings' earnest, eloquent voice, pleading on her behalf for an hour straight, had undone her. She had learned to brace herself against adversity and unkindness, the Boston Herald sympathized, but mercy and active friendliness were so new that she broke down before them. From the moment the prosecution rested, the whole tone of the trial changed. Outside, the pavement was still hot enough to vaporize a splash of water, but something like a breath of fresh air had found its way into the courtroom. Witnesses testified for minutes rather than hours at a time. People laughed, spectators and attorneys on both sides alike, rendering poor Sheriff Wright indignant. Lizzie Borden stopped, looking silently into her lap, and talked brightly with her lawyers, the conversation punctured with smiles and ripples of laughter, and she silenced into her handkerchief. Lawyer Jennings struck first with a series of witnesses who had all been seen suspicious characters in the vicinity of the Borden house on August 3rd and 4th. Late on the night before the murder, Miss Martha Chagon and her stepmother had been frightened by a noise, something that sounded like footsteps or pounding on wood, coming from the direction of the Borden fence. It lasted for 5 minutes, on and off. At about the same time, their neighbors to the north came across a stranger, senseless and unresponsive, but apparently not intoxicated, sprawled on the steps leading from the sidewalk in front of the Kirby house. Mr. Kirby hollered at the fellow and tried to shake him awake, with no luck. Around 9:45 or 9:50 the next morning, Miss Delia Manley and her sister noticed a young man they had never seen before loitering at the Borden's north gate. Leaning his arm on the gatepost, the way he watched and listened to what was going on in the street made the sisters think he was nosy or uneasy. Then there was the uncommonly pale young Dr. Handy, had seen walking slowly up 2nd Street with his eyes fixed on the sidewalk between 10:20 and 10:40. Everything about him, his parlor, agitation, and gait, combined with an expression so intense he seemed utterly oblivious to the surroundings, made the doctor slow his carriage and turn to watch. Later it seemed to Dr. Handy that he had seen that man once before, on 2nd Street. District Attorney Knowlton hardly needed to roll up his sleeves to discredit a good deal of that testimony. The Chagon's widows were shut, Knowlton discovered, and the women did not investigate the source of the sound. For all they knew, he pointed out, it might have come from the nearby ice house with its wooden carts and wooden floors. Whatever the noise was, it did not disturb their big Newfoundland dog enough to rouse him from the porch. Knowlton barely trifled with the young man leaning on the Borden gatepost, except to make it clear that he was standing right out in the open, making no attempt to conceal his face or hands or anything else about himself. He was so unremarkable that the sisters who saw him nearly walked right by without noticing him at all, nor could they describe him other than to say that he was about 30, dressed in light-colored clothing. Dr. Handy had it worst of all. From the moment he learned of the murder, he was convinced the pale stranger he had seen was just nerving himself up to go in and commit the crime. But Handy's reaction amounted to a gut feeling, next to impossible to express in a concrete way. He was moving very slowly, Handy tried to explain, and I imagine that he was... I beg your pardon, Knowlton interrupted, but I did not ask you what you imagined. It all seemed so flimsy by the time Knowlton was done. Next came the matter of the locks, 3 on the front door, a hook on the back screen, and keys to nearly every door on the inside. How could any of those suspicious characters get into what Knowlton had called the most uniquely locked house in Fall River? According to lawyer Jennings' next witness, Andrew Borden's cousin Jerome C. Borden, it could be done without even trying. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the day after the murders, with a police officer leaning on the front fence, Jerome walked right up to the front door and let himself in. Did you ring before you opened the door? Jennings asked. I did not. What did you do? Tell us exactly what you did. I walked up the steps and took hold of the doorknob and turned it and pushed the door open. The court would not allow Jerome to tell whether anyone inside was surprised to see him walk in, but that very fact, the lawyer Jennings attempted to ask the question, had likely given away the answer. The problem turned out to be the spring lock. If the door was not slammed hard, the lock would not catch. John Morse had noticed it, and had Miss Bingham. I found that unless the bolt was used, that the spring lock was not sure, she said on the witness stand. Unless the door was shut with a bang, you could not depend upon the spring lock working. What is your name? Jennings asked his next witness. Hyman Lebisky, the young man answered, and everyone knew at once that he was a foreigner. Only 18 or 19 years old, he'd been born in Russia and now peddled ice cream in Fall River. Every morning at 10:30, he fetched his team from Gardner's stable on 2nd Street and drove down Street to Mr. Wilkins' confectionery to load up his wagon, but on August 4th he'd been running late. His horse was still eating when he arrived, and Lebowski had to wait. It was a little after 11 by the time he left. Well, Jennings asked, when you got to the Borden's house, did you see anybody on the premises? Yes, sir. Whom did you see? I saw a lady come out the way from the barn right to the stairs back of the house. The north side stairs from the back of the house? Lebowski's English was not entirely clear. Right side of what? Lawyer Jennings asked. I saw a lady come out the way from the barn right to the stairs from the back of the house. Can you tell how she was dressed? She had on a dark-colored dress. A woman in a dark dress walking from the barn to the house a few minutes past 11 o'clock. Could it have been Lizzie Borden, just as she had said all along? Could it have been anyone else? Had you ever seen the servant who worked in the house? Jennings asked. Yes, sir, Lebowski answered. Had you delivered any ice cream to her? Yes, sir. How long before this? Oh, 2 or 3 weeks before the murder. Was the woman you saw the servant? Jennings asked. Again, Lebowski command of English obscured his answer. I saw the servant and the woman, too. Was the woman you saw the day of the murder the same woman as the servant? Jennings asked. No, sir. Are you sure about that? I am sure about it. Knowlton came at Lebowski like an angry bear, bewildering him with a merciless barrage of questions. You asked too fast, Lebowski finally protested. I can't understand what you mean. Yet Knowlton could not shake the young peddler's story. Even if Lebowski could not always express himself clearly, his confidence was evident. Insisting he left the stable just 2 blocks up from the Borden house by 11:05 or 11:10. Knowlton did eventually score a small victory. He clarified that Lebowski had seen the woman coming from the direction of the barn, as opposed to actually witnessing her leave the barn itself. No matter how Knowlton pushed, Lebowski remained adamant about everything else he had seen. What has a person got his eyes for, he said, but to look with? Next, Jennings called Thomas Barlow and Everett Brown, just 2 teenage boys who happened to be fooling around on 2nd Street on the most legendary morning in the Fall River's history. When you arrived near the Borden house, did you see any person leave the yard? Lawyer Jennings asked Thomas. Yes, sir. It was Inspector Dowtrey, headed towards Spring Street at a run. That had gotten their attention. What did you do then? We went in the side gate. You say, we? Who? Me and Brownie. Well, tell us what you did now. We went up to Mr. Sawyer, he was on the back steps, and asked him to let us go in the barn. And he wouldn't let us in, so we went in the barn. Once they worked up the nerve to go inside, Thomas and Brownie dared each other to go up into the loft, where they spent about 5 minutes hunting for murders in the hay and looking out the windows. Then they came down, pulled the door closed, and put the pin back in the house where they found it. The heat. How was the heat up in the barn compared with it in the sun, Lawyer Jennings asked Thomas Barlow. It was cooler up in the barn than was outdoors, the boy answered. Eyebrows must have raised on both sides of the courtroom. Anyone with a barn or attic of their own knew perfectly well how uncomfortable the upper story of the building gets on a summer's day, and for many, they alone was enough to throw Lizzie's alibi into doubt. Every one of the police officers said the barn was hot, extremely hot, close, stifling. Assistant Marshal Fleet thought it was one of the hottest days they'd had that summer. Even the peddler Lebowski agreed it was a hot day, and who would know better than an ice cream man? Since a preliminary hearing in September, District Attorney Knowlton had been saying that the 4th of August was one of the hottest days of the year, and the defense had never contradicted him. Someone should have, because it simply was not so. It was not even the hottest day in August. According to the United States Signal Service, the highest temperature recorded in Fall River, Massachusetts on August 4th, 1882 was a pleasant 83 degrees at 2 p.m. Mid-morning it would have been a tad cooler. The Fall River Evening News reported 79 degrees at 11 a.m. And 2 tiny details prove that the members of the Borden household found the weather far more sweltering. Before Andrew Borden settled down on the sofa for his fatal nap, he'd put on his reefer, a cardigan-like jacket. Minutes later, Bridget Sullivan grabbed a shawl when she ran out to fetch Dr. Bowen. Do you know Officer Medley? Jennings asked. No, sir, Thomas answered. Was there any officer there at the side gate when you went in? No, sir. Any on the walk? No, sir. Any on the steps? No, sir. The court was delighted, so amused by the boys' responses that the sheriff had to rap several times for order. District Attorney Knowlton did not share in the merriment. Me and Brownie had left Inspector Medley's claim of finding no footprints in the loft quite literally in the dust. Again and again he pressed both of them to state what time they'd entered the barn. To his relief, neither boy could. As it turned out, stating the time wasn't necessary. The events Thomas and Brownie witnessed were enough to single out the minutes between 11:37 and 11:40, just in time to see Inspector Doucher take off to telephone the marshal, and moments before Officer Allen returned with backup. It also did not matter that neither of the boys had noticed Inspector Medley's arrival. Brownie had virtually guaranteed they'd arrive first when he told Jennings. "I seen Officer Fleet when he was coming up the walk." By the time the boys were back down in the yard with the barn door fastened behind them, Medley had testified that he was on the Borden's lot only a minute or two before the Fleet arrived, and there was no way Medley could have gotten in and out of the barn in the scant 2 minutes without running smack into the boys. Medley himself had ruled out the possibility when he said he spent 8 to 10 minutes in the yard and house before heading out to the barn. That meant that by his own estimation, Inspector Medley entered the barn a good 5 minutes after Thomas and Brownie left. If that was so, how had he missed their footprints? The crowbar hatchet. I found Lizzie Borden's hatchet. The cry came from the roof of Joe Crow's barn just behind the Borden's yard on the evening of June 15th. A boy trying to retrieve a lost ball had discovered it. The handle weathered, the 3 3/4-inch blade spotted with rust, but beneath the rust a glint of gilt, indicating the hatchet had been new when it was lost. Almost no one would realize the significance of that detail until 1989, when District Attorney Knowlton's papers were donated to the Fall River Historical Society. Among his correspondence was a letter from medical examiner Frank W. Draper, dated May 31st, 1893, which revealed an extraordinary fact never brought to light during the trial. On one of the cuts in Miss Borden's skull, near the right ear, there's a very small but unmistakable deposit of the gilt metal with which hatchets are ornamented when they leave the factory. This deposit, Dr. Cheever confirmed this observation fully, means that the hatchet used in killing Miss Borden was a new hatchet, not long out of the store. The crowbar and hatchet remains missing to this day. Day 11th, Friday, June 16th, 1893. The heat had broken, stilling the constant flutter of papers fans. Governor Robinson reported a new pair of trousers for the second day in a row. His associates had proclaimed them lucky and insisted he wear them until the end of the trial. Most of the 11th morning had been devoted to beating the Matron Reagan fiasco into the ground, with 4 different witnesses swearing under oath. The matron had privately denied the story of the sisters' argument to each of them. Inspector Medley's footprint testimony, now dubbed Medley's cakewalk by the defense, had also been trampled by a Fall River Globe reporter who explored the barn before Thomas and Brownie. In the spectators' seats, however, interest in these details was growing stale. The people come for what they hoped would be the defense's grand finale, Miss Emma Borden, sister of the accused. From the blue feather in her hat to the tips of her patent leather boots, Emma was her sister's double. But her frame, and more delicate, her chin less prominent than Lizzie's, one look at her seemed enough to conclude that Emma was the milder of the two sisters. The heartbreak of the last 10 months was so plain upon her face that no matter what people thought of Lizzie, they felt for Emma. Emma began by reading the balances of Lizzie's 4 bank accounts at the time of the murder, totaling $2,811, almost $70,000 today. There were stocks in a local bank and mill as well. She did not have to say it outright. The figures spoke for themselves. Lizzie Borden was no millionaire, but she had no need of money. Next, Emma touched ever so lightly on the affection between Lizzie and their father, speaking of a ring belonging to Mr. Borden, the only article of jewelry he'd worn for the last 10 or 15 years. Lizzie had given it to him. Emma told the jury, and he'd worn it so constantly ever since that he had been buried with it. Finally, the subject everyone was waiting for, the Bedford cord. Everything Emma said about it aligned with Alice Russell's testimony. When it was made, the style and cut, the color and fabric, the paint stains. Now, where was that dress, if you know, on Saturday, the day of the search? Lawyer Jennings asked. I saw it hanging in the clothes press over the front entry, Emma said. At what time? I don't know exactly. I think about 9 o'clock in the evening. How came you to see it at this time? I went in to hang up the dress that I had been wearing during the day, Emma explained, and there was no vacant nail, and I searched around to find a nail, and I noticed this dress. Had she said anything to Lizzie about that? Jennings wanted to know. I said, you have not destroyed that old dress yet? Why don't you? It was like something out of a novel. Lizzie's steadfast sister, the only remaining member of her immediate family, shouldering the blame for Lizzie's most incriminating act. Could it be true? No one knew. Miss Emma Borden would dream of doubting her word. But some of the jurors must have wondered, if only for an instant, did Emma's loyalty run so deep that she would lie under oath to save her baby sister from the gallows? Underneath her placid exterior, Emma Borden had as much of the Borden metal as her sister, and it appeared the instant the district attorney confronted her upon Mr. Knowlton, she turned a cold, steely eye, a set mouth, and a proudly erected head, wrote the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. She nerved herself for him at the start, and she never relaxed her bold, calm demeanor for an instant. Both Emma and the district attorney knew this was Knowlton's last chance to prove one of his most vital points. No one but Emma was left to testify about the relationship with Lizzie and Miss Borden. Always it came down to the rift over Bertie Whitehead's house. And do you say that the relations were entirely cordial between Lizzie and her stepmother after that event? Knowlton asked. Yes, I do, Emma answered. Have you ever said differently? I think not. Did your sister change the form of address to her mother at that time? I can't tell you whether it was at that time or not. She formally called her mother, didn't she? Yes, sir. She ceased to call her mother, didn't she, practically? Yes, sir. And wasn't it about that time that she ceased to call her mother? I don't remember, Emma said. Knowlton poked and prodded, but Emma would not admit to any link between the two events. And don't you recall that was some time in connection with the transaction in relation to the house? Knowlton persisted. No, sir, Emma declared. I do not know when it was. Nor would she accept the notion that she herself had been the first to ask Lizzie what she was doing with the Bedford cord on a Sunday morning. Wasn't the first thing said by anybody, Lizzie, what are you going to do with that dress? Knowlton asked. No, sir, said Emma. I don't remember it so. If he could just get Emma to admit to asking that one question, it would compromise her own claim that she had told Lizzie to destroy the dress the night before. Why doesn't it seem so to you, if I may ask you? Why? Because the first I knew about it, my sister spoke to me. That is what I thought you would say, Knowlton remarked. He could only push so hard. Emma Borden was easily the most tragic figure in the whole affair. The motherless little girl who had grown up to see her father murdered and her sister tried for the crime. Knowlton could not afford to badger her in front of the jury, and Emma Borden would not give 1 inch.